how well you think biosecurity is being managed from what you're seeing in your experience on the farm.
Well, it's changing, and I'd have to say with the formation of the local land services in New South Wales, I certainly think biosecurity is the part of that portfolio that they're doing by far the best. So I think that's a real tick for how the new biosecurity legislation has been enacted. But I think we probably out there in the regions don't really understand what shared responsibility means yet in terms of practitioners. So there's probably a great understanding at institutional level and at an possibly at an LLS level and the people who work for those organisations. So I'm not sure the farming community probably gets that yet.
Helen, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that is the splitting of responsibilities, which, as I said, is inherent in our constitution. The Commonwealth is responsible for the border. The states are responsible for what is happening inside their borders from a regulatory and management point of view. And then, of course, farmers are responsible, or individuals are responsible for biosecurity in some ways on their own farms, but they need to be informed, and the complexity of the biosecurity threats that everyone is facing is a tremendous obstacle. Now, you can go to the internet and you can check it all, but it's very much seeing the wood for the trees. And so, for example, I started thinking calmly that I'd just have a look at what were the incursions and the interceptions that had occurred. In the animal world, it's very easy because there haven't been many incursions. We've got most of the animal diseases sorted. Prawn, white spot in prawns would be a clear exemption from that statement. But it's few and far between. They're well known. The diseases of cattle, the diseases of sheep and so on are quite well known. In the plant area, you've got a huge array of pests and diseases. You've got a huge array of potentially invasive insects, which may or may not have a major impact. For example, the Russian wheat aphid was on the list of the top 40 pests that might enter Australia. Well, it did enter Australia, and it entered last year, I think, and it has spread from South Australia. It was picked up in the middle of South Australia, so it's anyone's guess how it got there, but it has spread to Victoria and I believe southern New South Wales. Now, it's not devastating the wheat fields as it was feared that it might, and it's being managed now as another aphid. So it's very hard sometimes to predict which of these pests will be really diabolical and which will not. And it's being included, as I understand, in the management of the normal grains management of wheat farmers are now being able to filter that in. And of course it will need R&D and adaptive management. But then, the prawn disease, of course, is a case in point where that disease can cause up to 100% mortality in 2 weeks in farmed prawns. So that's a very severe disease and very difficult to manage. So it's been handled by destocking and with all those issues.
Yep. $25 million worth of destocking, in fact, in the southeast Queensland region. You have a question here. I can take.
Thanks. Joe Lane from GHD. Both Helen and Lucinda spoke about the splitting of responsibilities, and I was just wondering if, in Helen, your terms of reference, you were going to review that, because we often hear about when those responsibilities are split and the states have that responsibility for post-border incursions, we hear that word harmonisation. But I've worked on a lot of reviews of different programs, and it seems that we're very much short of achieving that harmonisation between states in their legislation and regulation. So I was just wondering if that could be part of your portfolio or not.
It's not strictly speaking, because my role is to look at what the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture and Water Resources is doing in the field of biosecurity. But of course, one of the things they are doing in the field of biosecurity is to participate in national arrangements. However, there has just been a review of the Intergovernmental Agreement on Biosecurity, IGAB, and that review, I think, is about to be, the draft, May. Oh, the final will be out in May. The draft is out on the internet now for comment and so on. I think it's probably nearly finished. And certainly that is looking at what ways there might be to overcome this potential disconnect. We have a plethora of committees, arrangements, contingency plans. One thing that Australia has formed, which I think is tremendous, is Animal Health Australia and Plant Health Australia, that both have Commonwealth, state and industry represented on them and can form a united front. But potentially those arrangements need strengthening and need reinforcement and always re-examination to see if they're still fit for purpose.
And the question is to you as well.
Probably nothing to add.
Okay, so there's a question.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Carolyn Chudley from Holman Fenwick-Willen. The question I have is really, I'd appreciate the view of the panel, and perhaps just their opinion as to whether or not you think we have enough students getting into science and agri-related and vet-related subjects at university to make sure that we do have the people power that we're going to need for biosecurity in the future.
I think there is a pipeline gap. We sort of woke up to this about 10 years ago, that we suddenly are underdone with graduates in science generally, agricultural science particularly. We have built, is it 3 new vet schools, Bruce? We've got a new one in Adelaide. Charles Sturt started about 10 years ago, and we've got JCU up in Queensland. So we have built quite a lot of new veterinary capacity, but I guess the question is, are there enough jobs? And are they all going to be employed? I think more broadly that the emphasis now on STEM. New South Wales has done a great job with the review of agricultural education by Jim Prattley and identified a lot of things that we can do better, especially in the sort of agricultural high schools that are owned by the Department of Education in New South Wales. And I've been personally involved in quite a lot of the sort of the implementation of that review, so I've been really pleased with how the two departments together have dealt with those recommendations. So I think there's a bright light, but there's going to be a bit of a gap in that capacity in sort of mid-career.
The IGAB review recently pointed out just how missing environment was in this whole biosecurity space, and we have in fact the Invasive Species Council lobby, Andrew Cox, here with us today, so he can pick up on this.
I'll come out from behind the post too. So Andrew Cox, Invasive Species Council. I'm just wondering whether we're thinking broadly enough about biosecurity and beyond just horticulture and livestock. And a lot of farmers have native plants, animals, birds on their land, and they're interested in it, and there's lifestyle issues. So maybe from a farmer's perspective, are we doing enough to help the environment, protect the environment from biosecurity as well as our industries?
I doubt that. There's been so much effort, say, in New South Wales in terms of, say, review of weeds, which goes into the national parks areas as well as the farmed environment. Weeds are managed at a local level by councils, so there's quite a bit of fragmentation in, say, weeds on public lands versus, so in terms of sort of threatening biodiversity in either, protected areas on farm or in sort of publicly owned areas. So I think, no, I don't think we're doing enough. And I think the big question that came out of that review was how do we coordinate those efforts better so that the new species that come out of the nursery industry, we're seeing all sorts of incursions of plants. We do it on our farm, especially with the changing climate. We see plants growing out in the bush that weren't there 10 years ago.
Last week I was in the UK visiting CABI, an organisation that we fund, and because I was Australian, they presented a whole lot of information on what they're doing in invasives in Australia, and they were putting up all the different plants that they've been working on. They started with the rubber vine example, and using biocontrol, they're introducing a rust from Madagascar. And the benefit cost, so they've done a lot of review of the success of these, so this was in Queensland, of the success of these programs, and this one had a benefit cost analysis of 108 to 1, which is totally unheard of. I mean, we get very excited when we get 60 to 1, which a lot of our programs do. That was to agriculture. The cost to the ecosystem, the tropical ecosystem, they considered priceless. So it's really hard to put a price on these things, but they're, very, very important, as you say, not just to the agricultural systems, but also the natural systems.
And Mick Keogh. Oh, my apologies. No, it was Mick first. Sorry, Bev.
Thanks, Serena. One of the more interesting developments over recent times has been the opening up of 3 international airports in regional Australia, so Cairns, Wellcamp and Canberra. Helen, I'm wondering whether you think that there's been sufficient attention paid to the potential changing risk where an increasing number of overseas visitors, instead of being, in a sense, quarantined on the coast, might in fact be landing straight in the heartland in terms of the agricultural systems, and whether that's been considered as part of the changing risk.
Well, I certainly noticed this with the in doing the mosquito review that I talked about, because it became apparent that when, for example, new facilities are under construction, that all sorts of disruption occurs, and programs that might be there to make the area less receptive for any pests coming in, such as invasive mosquitoes, they go by the board while the construction's going on. And similarly, the design, if you design things to manage some of those pests and to make the habitat less suitable for them to lodge in if they arrive, that's can be very beneficial. But it's very hard to do if you've already built the whole airport and you've hardwired in some of those risks, essentially. But in terms of passenger risks and cargo risks coming into what's really passenger risks coming into new airports, and possibly cargo as well, I think the department certainly is looking at it. I haven't looked at it as a specific item, but it's certainly something that would be worthy of review, depending on how they're handling it. But I certainly have really felt that designing biosecurity into these first ports of entry is a really critical part of the pathway. Even more important is working out how you can keep the risk offshore, which in the case of passengers is education before they get on the plane. And now we've got parcel traffic coming through on the internet. The department's working to put notices up on Amazon and eBay and so on, that every time someone orders something to come in, a quarantine notice comes up, a biosecurity notice. So, it's just really adaptive management of those risks all the time. Certainly one that needs looking at.
Did anyone else want to answer a question? Because there's another question at the back here. Thank you.
My name's Robert Hardy. I'm from New South Wales Farmers. Lucinda, you made the observation in your wonderful presentation about the need for a body to manage biosecurity when the plant biosecurity CRC expires at the end of June next year. There are, of course, now 2 competing proposals on the table for the future of plant biosecurity, both the CRC model and a combined RDC coordinated model. I suppose all 3 of you, but principally Lucinda and Helen, the relative merits of them, and how do we ensure that farmers in particular are left with the best outcome rather than whichever one is left to them by decision makers and bureaucrats?
Well, I think the CRC model is great, but it's 7 years, or the new model is 10 years, so it's not actually permanent. And I just think the size of Australia and the quantum of the issues that we face, I just feel it needs to have a more permanency than that. It would give much more career stability to the scientists we hope will work in this area for our, sort of our industries and our landscape and our national parks and all the things that we want to do. So I would see it as much greater than an RDC funded model. I'd see it as a long-term institution.
Melissa, did you want to pick up on that, given that you know the people involved?
Yeah, just to comment that we support the idea of a permanent coordinating national body. So, the permanence is important. As long as we continue to have access to the high-quality scientists that we've been able to work with and partner with in the work that we're doing, and as I've hopefully shown in my presentation, it works both ways. But yes, we're very supportive, and we've had really successful partnerships with the CRC to date.
And a question.
I think that if there could be a hybrid model, having a permanent organisation, but trying to take some of the best things from the CRC program, and in my opinion, the best things are bringing the universities in and focusing them on industry problems, and so getting that real engagement between students, because it's largely students that do some of the legwork, getting them involved in practical things but applying their science in novel means is a really important thing. And so if that can be built into the new organisation, and maybe rolling tranches of funding that allow employment and deployment of enough young people, be terrific.
Goes back to your point, Christine. Yes, up the back.
Hi, I'm Brad Warren from Ocean Watch. Specifically interested in white spot disease, as you'd imagine. Just bear with me, because I'm going to try and conflate pistol and boo, shared responsibility, populist media and white spot disease together and get some comments. Now, some of the threat mitigation around biosecurity really includes community understanding what the threats are. And in the case of white spot disease, one of the probably outstanding vectors for that disease to be spread is through recreational fishers using imported uncooked prawns as bait, and that's the likely vector in this this time. The comment about white spot disease, destocking $25 million worth of prawns out of ponds, that is indeed a deep loss, but crustaceans underpin the productivity of the entire marine environment. Now, when this stuff gets out into the wild, it could have untold consequences for the marine environment. Pistol and Boo arrived here, and Barnaby Joyce, the minister, got slammed in populist media because he wanted to get rid of Pistol and Boo, and if they weren't to be taken away, they were going to be shot. He couldn't prosecute the case in populist media that biosecurity threat was important. So how do we use a community response as a mitigation to a threat when the community don't see that there is a threat?
Helen, did you want to pick up on white spot?
Oh, well, I was just going to do pistol and boo.
Go if you like.
Because having dealt with rabies in Indonesia, it's inexorably spreading, insidiously spreading, and once it gets into a place, it got into Bali, it's still there. It's incredibly difficult to get rid of it. And as transport moves around, you've got people moving around Indonesia on ferries. If it gets to Papua, the risk is that rabies will come down through PNG, through the Torres Strait and hit northern Australia. So there's a lot of work going on now to prevent that happening. One of the arguments for the main argument, I believe, for not allowing a pistol and boo episode to go unnoticed is the prevention of rabies. Not that it's likely, but it's a disease that occurs in America, and people who are as casual with the regulations as that couple were may well not have been vaccinating their animals, and it could have been bitten by a raccoon or a skunk or whatever. So to my mind, the only way you can educate the community, and I think Barnaby Joyce tried hard, but the way you do it is to come back to what is the real threat, what's the worst thing that could happen if this happened, and I believe in that case it was rabies. In the question of white spot, as I say, I'm just embarking on this review and about to do intensive travel around and talking to people from next week, but what I've understood so far and from the Senate is that, and departmental information, is that there was a risk assessment, an import risk analysis completed in 2009 and implemented from 2010, and that greatly strengthened the import conditions at that time from what they previously were. Now then, there's been implementation of that for the next 7 years until this outbreak occurred, and as I understand from what's been presented at the Senate hearings so far, there's been some failures of implementation. The pathway by which the disease came here is not clear, but obviously you never completely know, as with the example of the Russian wheat aphid. But whatever will happen is that the issue is that imports have been suspended of uncooked prawns since January, and part of my review will be looking at what are the biosecurity conditions that might pertain to future trade in prawns and prawn products. So I'll be looking at that fairly carefully, and I'll appreciate submissions. I do agree with you that risks to the wild environment have to be high on our consideration. It's not just the farm prawns, but data is very difficult to get, and so if Ocean Watch has any data or surveillance or watching briefs, we'll be very glad to hear about it.
I really am sure we could go on for the rest of the afternoon, but it has to be the last question because of all your work demands, and it's up here. This question up here.
Yeah, hi, it's Mike Foley from The Land. I just thought to ask about, we touched on climate change, changing rainfall patterns, but, well, as a member of the decliningly populist media, I guess we'd want to know, to coin a phrase, what are the known unknowns and what are the unknown unknowns, if that makes sense? How much focus is being put on the potential risks from climate change, and how well understood is that?
Well, that could go all afternoon from there. So,
we've got a lot of data about, say, the onset of summer and the onset of winter and the changes. There's a lot of biophysical data that really illustrates, in our environment, which is, I suppose a winter-dominant rainfall, or it was. So we know. So I suppose what we probably need is a bit of a science desktop study on what does this mean in terms of incursions, because, I probably don't have a clue, to be honest. All I can say is we've seen lots of changes in our environment. So, but I think, the data's in. Most of the farming community no longer question climate change because they're seeing it in every production season, and there's a small number of vocal ones who don't.
Yeah, I don't really know where to start with that, except from an international perspective. There's been a huge amount of modelling done by, the best scientists on the planet coming together to look at the impact on growing seasons and the impact on the sort of varieties and the traits of varieties that we need to have in the future, when in some countries like Australia it's been predicted that the coolest edge of the growing season is going to be hotter than the hottest edge we've ever come across to date. So obviously the varieties we're growing now aren't going to thrive. And along with that is the movement of pests and diseases. And so under these new conditions, what sort of pests and diseases are we going to see? And so that's part of the plant breeding effort, trying to incorporate the possible pests and diseases that are going to be coming in. So there's a lot happening, but in terms of giving you figures, I think we're not at that point to get so specific in terms of local regional data.
Yes, so I guess for the specific biosecurity threats for the animal industries, the key things from a climate change perspective, apart from straight heat stress, which is not biosecurity, but is the movement of vector-borne diseases and insect pests, which then can carry things like blue tongue and so on. We have a national arbovirus monitoring program, which presumably is tracking where different insects go, and then hopefully the viruses aren't there for them to spread, but that is an increasing risk. In terms of the plant industries, it's much bigger issue because you've got not only insect pests, but you've also got susceptibility to different diseases that are temperature sensitive. So it's a much bigger spectrum of threats, I would suggest. And of course, both invasive animals and invasive plants will be, their distribution will be affected profoundly by climate changes.
Okay, well, it would be nice to carry on for the rest of the afternoon, but I think we should thank the panel very much. So Lucinda Corrigan, Melissa Wood and Helen Scott-Orr.